Welcome to VNAKS, everybody. I'm Andrew, chairing the session today, and it's part of our Kant and series, which is an effort to generate discussion about Kant as connected to things that aren't typical for anthropologies and conference discussions, or at least not as typical as some of the classical Kantian topics. This time we're talking about Kant and intersectionality, which is a really interesting topic. And we have the kind of typical format, 2 talks, commentators for each talk. We'll try to take a couple minutes break in between the 2 talks. And with that, I'll just hand it over to our first speaker, who is Helga Varden from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champagne. And Helga is going to give us a overview talk, I think, a Kantian account of intersectionality. Take it away, Helga.
Hi, thank you. I don't know if I will take it away, but I will at least share my thoughts or my current thoughts on this very complex topic. As you all know,
everybody needs to mute if possible.
Let's see if we can, yeah. As everybody know by now, Kimberly Crenshaw is the one who coined the phrase intersectionality. Perhaps what not everybody knows, unless they actually also read the article, she developed this term in many ways from an inspiration I think you can track back to Sojourner Truth and Anna Cooper. Sojourner Truth, in some ways, and for those who are more used to think along with Black men thinkers or philosophical minds, Sojourner Truth was contemporary with Frederick Douglass, whereas Anna Cooper was contemporary with Du Bois. So in some ways, they're 2 very early generations in the type of movements that started roughly in the period when slavery was ended. So Sojourner Truth lived some of her life in slavery. Anna Cooper was only, I think, 7 when slavery was formally abolished in the US. So I thought it would be appropriate, given that we are starting a talk on Kant and history, with hearing one of the speeches that has become so legendary and important for intersectionality, which is a speech that Sojourner Truth gave at a meeting for a suffrage movement in Akron, Ohio, in, I think, 1849. Okay, so I'm not entirely sure. It could be 1851, but I know that the speech wasn't written right away, so I'm not entirely sure, actually. I'm going to give the various versions of this, but it is the one that Ain't I a Woman or Aren't I a Woman, that phrase comes from. And it's the one that I think is the closest to how Sojourner Truth herself gave this speech. Now, important to know, so this is a meeting then with a lot of people fighting for rights, for women, for African-American, and it is in a small place with a lot of white supremacists right outside the doors, making a lot of noise. She has been listening to the arguments presented often by white women and Black men, and it's in this context that she gives this speech. So.
May I say a few words? I want to say a few words about this matter.
Helga, sorry, I think some of us are having issues. Do you mind
Yeah,
trying
it's suddenly.
try unmuting yourself and see if that helps.
Man, a quart.
Yeah.
Why can't she have her little
Why don't you
Yeah,
go
go
back
back.
say a few
and
words?
just leave yourself unmuted?
I
Thank you.
want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man, and I can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed. And can any man do better than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man, and I can eat as much too, if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is today. As for intellect, all I can say is if a woman have a pint and a man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear we will take too much, for we can't take much more than a pint will hold. The poor men seem to be all in confusion. They don't know what to do. Why, children, if you have woman's rights, give it to her and you will feel better. You have your own rights and there won't be so much trouble. I can't read, but I can hear. And I have heard the Bible and learned that Eve caused man to sin. But if woman upset the world, to give her a chance to set it right side up again. The lady has spoken about Jesus, how he never spurned woman from him, and she was right. When Lazarus died, Mary and Martha came to him with faith and love and besought him to raise their brother. And Jesus wept, and Lazarus came forth. And how came Jesus into the world? Through God who created him, and woman who bore him. Man, where is your part? But women are coming up. Blessed be God, and a few of the men are coming up with him. But men is in a tight place. The poor slave is on him. The women are coming on him, and he is surely between a hawk and a buzzard.
Okay, so you now just heard the first version, 1851, of Sojourner Truth's Aren't I a Woman? Cooper came a little bit later, and as you know about Crenshaw, this formulation here is quite central to the way in which she coined her intersectionality concept. And so Anna Cooper says, and this is, by the way, she writes this and she gives it as a speech to a room full of Black ministers, and she's the only woman there, and she's just finished her undergrad. And so she takes them on and she says to them all, only the Black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special patronage. Then and there, the whole Negro race enters with me. Now, how do I make this work properly? There we go. Today's talk then, in my view, whatever we want to talk about when we talk about Kant, and when we try and develop a Kantian conception of intersectionality, in some fundamental sense, should start with a place like this one. It was thoughts delivered roughly at the time when Kant died, so quite contemporary with him. And part of our challenge is to take on the Kantian heritage that is not probably until today, many of you ever heard this talk. And that is at any Kant talk. That's important for us when we take on our heritage, in my view, our Kantian heritage, because we want to struggle with and understand how come it took us Kantians who are so drawn to this theory of freedom in Kant, how come it took us until today to actually read the voices of the people who were enslaved at the time, and who also were denied, brilliant minds were denied access to education. So with a bit of humility, I think we should approach this topic. It's also with a bit of humility to us as a practice, that this fact that is perhaps today, or maybe a year ago, that there would be a Kant talk on freedom. Until today, you hadn't been hearing or reading this kind of work. Having said that, then, let me try and show where I'm currently in my thinking around dehumanization or intersectionality in Kant. So what I've been working the most on so far is both the general question of how to do it in Kant's works, which pieces in Kant's work are particularly interesting or useful as I try and develop my conception, and also literally how to write it. And then when we move to intersectionality that involves racialization, how to also do it well, given that I fare the world in the way I do, as coming from Norway originally and looking like this. So as perhaps many of you know, I've done a lot more work on gender and sexuality, and I just published a book on that not so very long ago. And to me, in many ways, that was much easier to do, exactly because I live so much of that oppression. So it's much easier to talk to it and try and do, at least not do damage when I do it. It's much harder once you involve racialization, given the both where I live in the US, but also the history of racism. Now, as you will see on the screen right now, this talk was originally framed as a 1-hour talk, and I don't have time to do that today. So I will give a much shorter version, just trying to show to you the main tools I'm using as I'm going about this, both the theoretical tools, but also then the kinds of things or method and how I try to do, bring this topic to life in Kant. I don't think I will get all the way to modernity, though I do think it's quite important to have modernity to be able to talk about how racialization and racism today works. Somebody has their microphone on, so it would be, thank you. So let me start with just showing you these tools that I use, though I suspect I don't have much time to talk in any detail about them, perhaps until after Jordan's comments or perhaps in the Q&A. I have found that the best place to start when you want to talk about these types of issues in Kant is to go to his account of human nature. You find that in his religion. It's a very underdeveloped account, and it is an account that is quite dominated in the literature by very rationalist approaches. And so for me, part of the challenge has been to take on and show a different way to do Kant on this account of human nature. Very important for me has been, certainly in the sex, love, and gender work, has been this account of animality, humanity, and personality, and in particular, animality. Very, very briefly, I basically defend that it's certainly possible, and I think Kant often writes in a way that captures this, that animality are 3 reflexively conscious or self-conscious way of being oriented in the world. So it has to do with how already from you are newborn, you strive to be safe, you are susceptible to sensuous touch, and also to affectionate love. You cannot yet use very much other than associate thought, but it is already there as you are born. Then I argue also when you are born, you can see brute freedom in that the baby screams, and you can see quite early on in a newborn baby, I think it's roughly around 3 months or something, that the baby can start smiling, which is a social self, a sense of self. So it can relate to an image of itself. So Kant here borrows heavily on the social sense of self from Rousseau, and it's quite important to try and capture everything about the way in which we present socially in the world. So it has a lot to do with social emotions. As you know, perhaps, this stuff in Kant is the stuff that we also develop, this brute freedom, through becoming able to act on abstract concepts, ultimately reason, so act on maxims that ultimately leads to an ability to universalize maxims, to use abstract conceptual thought, which again becomes important for reasoning. In addition, in Sex, Love, and Gender, aesthetics and teleological imagination is very important for how I develop the account. And basically, with all these tools in place, it's possible to capture a lot of the kinds of topics you want to be able to capture when it comes to philosophy of sex and love, and also feminist philosophy, all the way from issues like sexual orientation to gender identity, to what it is like to be a woman, etc. These tools are extremely useful. I also argue, and this is one of the tools for those of you who want to just have a little bit more technical Kant stuff, vital force becomes very important to me to show how animality has value for us, even though it doesn't have moral value. I borrow a lot when we try and think about this from both Kant and Arendt on wisdom, on how becoming a wiser person involves learning to feel and think about and identify these aspects of us. And I think Anakrupa is very useful that too. But I don't have more time right now because I have to be a bit quick. In addition, I also find that Kant's account of evil is very useful to capture a lot of sexual violence or the ways in which things become patterned in our society. Again, super quickly, what I find most convincing and most powerful philosophically is to understand frailty as an instance of wrongdoing, and it can be non-self-deceived or self-deceived, meaning either I know that I own that I did something wrong, or I tell a story, a moralizing story about what I did. I prefer to use impurity as tracking patterns of thought. They can be non-self-deceived or self-deceived. I can know I have an anger problem, or I can tell myself it's the world that's wrong. And then I find depravity particularly useful once we get into brutal, violent oppression, which on this approach I'm developing is always self-deceived. So the worse it gets, the more we use moralizing language, which also means, of course, it's a challenge, say, you can do it with Kantian language, because Kantian language has incredible social power because of the way in which you can use the freedom language so powerfully. Now, so if we look to Kant the guy, what did he not do wrong and what did he do wrong? In my view, what he didn't do wrong is that on the very central places in his philosophy, just abstractly understood, he never lost sight of how these theories that ultimately he develops into racist, sexist, and gender theories, but these moves in his philosophy that have a lot to do with animality and also the social sense of self, they're contingent and not objective. I find that that's extremely important when we try and capture differences between value and moral value, but also how we then go about doing wrong. What did he do wrong? I think the main problem for him in what he just literally did wrong was that when he tried to engage these extremely difficult topics, he proceeded, or he followed a method that is top down rather than bottom up, which means that he sort of had the kind of doing philosophy. He did it in the way we are quite used to in our practice at the moment, which is you try and figure out everything else, sort of, if you do with Kant, first critique, transcendental apperception, or categorical imperative, or principles of innate, private, and public right. And then once you figured out all of that stuff, then you just apply them to a phenomenon. sort of a little bit sort of like that. The worst versions we have of that, of course, is if you've written a lot of transcendental perception and then you just sort of apply it in your spare time. You're thinking about other things to the world. Kant did a lot of that, in my view. And he should not have done that. And in fact, his own philosophical system entails that he should not have done that. He should have gone bottom up, which means that if he wanted to talk about topics, he should first make sure that he truly understands those topics and the lives he is trying to critique. As a general rule, he was terrible at that. In the same way, I think that our philosophical practice is. So what I suggest and how I am going about it for now, again, doing a little bit of a speed version here, I am thinking that it is extremely important as we engage in Kant on these topics, and even more so if we don't know the lives first personally, who are listening to the people, the thinkers of this time, who had distinctly philosophical minds and who were denied access to academia or philosophy, who knew life under oppression and who strived to capture it theoretically. So currently, I am spending a lot of time thinking through the ideas left behind for us by this set of thinkers. I find that it is a central way in which I can understand the phenomenon. It's a central way to develop the theory at all. I also try a lot to focus on the way in which, or try and pay attention, part of the listening, whether I read, but also whether I listen in the world, is to try and figure out what's the way in which these pathologies, the various ism pathologies, what's the direction they have? Can we say something a bit more general, or is all extremely specific? But even if it is extremely specific, what are the patterns we're looking at or should pay attention to? And I think there are quite a lot of patterns, such as the way in which oppression, living subject to oppression, means that you feel yourself subject to forces that fundamentally deny you a sense of being home in the world, safety in your own body, beauty in your social presentation, and economic independence. So usually when you look at also the violence that ultimately comes threatened, it's often aimed at our animality, followed by shaming and disempowering activities in social and public spaces. It's also the case, and if you look at now back to the general theory, you can see then that one way to start developing the more abstract theory about it can use animality and social sense of self, etc., to do that, and also the whole way in which we present publicly. I'm going to skip a little bit more. I also spend a lot of time, though, trying to use Arendt's distinction between pariah and parvenu, that is being an outcast and trying to live as a token, to capture some of the difficulties in general, but also, of course, in academia when you have oppressed identity. The other thing I am thinking a lot about, and I'm going to stop in 2 minutes, so I'm just going to give you a taste of it, is that once you move from intersectional space or that analysis, then central to any account of it has to be to try and figure out or struggle with the ways in which oppression usually involves more than one. It involves also oppression of the people who are in your group. It has to have this topic of betrayal involved. It's a huge topic, trying to live this life. And various ways in which the systemic forces are such that you cannot succeed on your own. Finally, which is enormously important in my view, an intersectional analysis has to be able to capture how the pathologies multiply each other. So it is not the case that living subject to sexism and racism just means that you are subject to the sum of those two. pathologies, the nature of pathologies is such that they generate, or how we use them, they generate new pathologies or multiply the pathologies in specific ways. So I'm not going to talk much more, but this is then the general way in which I'm working on it. I try now to pay a lot of attention to specific groups, oppressed group, trying to figure out what exactly distinguishes the various forces from each other, if we can. How does this dehumanization work? How can I use concepts like the evil? When is it depraved? What's depraved versions of it? What are pattern versions of it? What are instances of it? How do people use it, etc., etc. Okay, I'll actually sneak and do one more sentence. The last thing I try and speak to, that I think we all need to try and speak to at least, is this way in which, and I think Arendt is right about this, there is something very specific or distinctive about modern evil. It took evil to a new level. And so my current suggestion is there's not all types often associated group with an animality, lowered animality, and then some use that in house depressed. My current hypothesis is that in modernity, we went to war with animality. And not only, that was sort of a first one, we went to war against it, but it also, once you go to war with it, one way it opens up in totalitarian regimes is that all spontaneity can become a source of danger. But I don't have more time now, so I want to hand it over to Jordan, who gets to talk a little bit, and then to all of us for conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Helga, for that talk. Yeah, let's all take a moment to yeah, it's really, really useful. So thank you for both this paper and for your work on sexuality, which I think has provided all of us with, or many of us with resources for doing additional dimensions of Kantian analysis in ways that have been really important. So what I want to do just very briefly is say something about intersectionality as a method for Kant scholarship, reflect a little bit on what I see you doing in this paper, and then ask a few questions about it. So I think that the question that it's worth asking is just, should we be doing intersectionality in Kant scholarship? This question came up a month ago in a VNAKS session, and I want to sort of adapt, as I did then, an insight from Rafiq Hassan, who was talking about wanting to use Kant kind of against himself, right? And so I think there's a case to be made for the claim that part of why it's so important to do intersectional analysis of Kant is precisely because Kantian theorizing has been so resistant to it, and because Kant's own commitment to categorical and, as you put it, top-down thinking makes his thinking seem particularly hostile to intersectional critique. And also, obviously, because intersectionality is one of the most powerful tools we have in 21st century theorizing. It is remaking our collective understandings of the world. And frankly, we are way behind in Kant scholarship, where we tend to still treat race, gender, sexuality, and so on as separate problems, right, that we need to deal with in distinct areas of Kant scholarship. But there's a danger. So those are reasons why we should, right, be doing Kantian intersectionality. But there's a danger here too, that when we come at Kant from an intersectional perspective, we appropriate resources from Black feminist and feminist of color scholarship, and we deploy it to make Kant or other historical figures relevant, or to recenter these Eurocentric Enlightenment philosophical ideas in contemporary philosophical theorizing. So the question that I want to ask here is, how do we hold Kant accountable to intersectional theorizing in ways that do not simply presuppose his usefulness to intersectional and feminist analysis? And in asking this, I want to center accountability itself as a critical intersectional methodology, foundational to the kind of bottom-up coalitional approach that intersectionality sort of entails. And I'm getting this from, for example, the Combahee River Collective statement, from Patricia Hill Collins' work, and from contemporary feminists like Alexis Pauline Gumbs and Christy Dawson. So in today's talks, Helga, I see you, and also I know in Reza's talk, thinking about some methods for this accountability problem. So Helga, your paper insists on a bottom-up approach, right? Akin to that, in parallel to the move developed by intersectionality theorists, which provides Kantians with critical resources for reading Kant in this direction. And I think your book is especially good on giving us rigorous methods for reading Kant from the bottom up that should be closely examined by anybody interested in taking up these questions. And at the same time, in exploring, right, the question of like what Kant did wrong, as well as what he may have done right, you take up this question of accountability and you posit it as prior to any possible analysis of the resources in Kant for thinking about oppression. You do this by identifying the blindnesses and exclusions in his theory, and by shifting the perspectives from which we approach these questions. For example, the lived experience of oppressed groups, the excluded figures from the historical tradition, and so on. So I want to ask how we push on this question of intersectionality, this question of accountability in an intersectional key. How do we learn to do more than posit the question of Kantian accountability in single axis terms, taking up the problems of racism, sexism, heterosexism, and so on in his philosophy as if they were distinct problems, distinctly located in his work, and then applied, right, to the lived experience of those at the intersections of these oppressions. Or to put it differently, if the insights of these sidelined historical figures, for example, offer one approach for doing this, then we might ask, why do we still need Kant? And this gets me to my second methodological point, which is thinking beyond Kimberly Crenshaw's intersection analogy, right? That famous analogy from her 1989 paper. To conceptualize intersectionality more broadly as what Patricia Hill Collins has called the matrix of oppression, which I think significantly remaps our understanding of what oppression is. This is to say that intersectional theorizing requires us to do more, I think, than attend to the ways in which single axis forms of oppression intersect or compound one another, by rigorously attending to the ways that race, gender, class, compulsory sexuality, and heterosexuality, and so on, are always present in the argument, that they are implicit in the construction of the human, or of morality, or justice, and so on, in ways that perhaps trouble this distinction between what's objective and what's contingent in Kant's arguments. And this can mean, for example, right, insisting on the ways that gender is always raced for Kant, so that his account of proper or real womanhood is mapped against those who fail to be women, or attending to the ways that his account of whiteness is often his account of the human. So I think this means if we read intersectionality this way, it can do more than reveal patterns of oppression or allow us to locate the experiences of multiply oppressed groups. It offers a methodology for locating how these oppressions are constructed within the theory itself as an integral part of the project of defining the human and its attendant projects of rationality, morality, justice, and so on. And so my question is, how do the varied and intersecting forms of oppression and dehumanization that you map here contribute to a stable notion of the human? In other words, the proper Kantian agent against whom the oppressed are mapped as a kind of exception. And this is to say, right, how should a bottom-up approach, like the one you sketch here, hold the top-down approach accountable for its very construction of the human against which these processes of dehumanization are visible? So, thank you.
Thank you. And I think like there's a way in which every time we talk about this, that you ask the same question. And so I want you to ask the same question until you're happy with the answer. So until you're happy with the answer, I know I don't have enough to say on it. Anyway, so today's reflections on some of the topics, though I'll talk more depending a little bit on how many questions there are, okay? Here's one just cautionary thing. So I've been presenting on this work, since it was almost only me doing it. So I've been living with the oppression from all the groups right? The Kantians, the feminists, the LGBTQIA. And I am not entirely sure if the reason why I just keep doing it anyway is because I'm just a contrarian at heart, you know. If everybody agrees with that, well, then I should try the other. I don't know. It's possible that some serious levels of self-deception involved there. Perhaps another reason is I don't think that self-deception and depravity is only a problem among Kantians. That's another way, in some ways, to say the same thing. So if I were to push back, I would also say that there are lots of troubles in our profession, and it doesn't matter which group of people I go to and listen to talks. There's a lot of self-deception, and there's a lot of prejudices, and there's a lot of closed mindedness. And so I don't think that we become good thinkers just by, say, not doing Kantian philosophy or doing Kantian philosophy. It's much more difficult than that, which also is perhaps my, at least today, response to the stable humanity. I don't think that's the creatures we are. I think if one reason to also read Kant and Evil is that would be nice if we are such that we can overcome it, and then we're going to be good ever after. I think that's absolutely not a chance that's going to happen, given the kinds of beings we are. And I think Kant is quite good at getting at that trouble with us. He gives us some tools with which at least we can speak about it. Maybe my last answer is something like this, though I totally realize that it could be wishful thinking too, or something else that I don't understand. I often have guided what I do by whether or not in these crowds that I give these talks on these unpopular topics, there is somebody who just thinks this is interesting and I need to think about it. To me, there's something about that open-mindedness that isn't at the heart of why I do philosophy at all. There's something like, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that, and I should think about that. So I keep doing it. Do I know, will I save the world? Totally not, definitely not. It's meaningful to me, and my aim is not to give the answer. That's one way to say it too. I just want to try and make the tools available, so that those who get the tools maybe can do something with them I cannot, or maybe it can be useful for how they live their lives. Does it mean that everybody will like it? And I think no. If you like Kantian type thinking, really like it, like I like it, you like systematicity. It actually, it's one way in which you learn to live with oppression, is to learn to understand it systematically. And I think many people don't do that. And it doesn't mean that it's better to do it this way, but to me, it's very meaningful. And so sometimes I also have students or people who live their lives and it's like, oh, that's a good tool. So perhaps my ambitions are less huge in a way for why I do what I do. But that's today's answer. And thank you as always.
Okay, thanks to you both. Really fascinating talk. Thanks, Helga. Thanks, Jordan, for really fascinating discussion. Important. Okay, I think we should just, since we're at past time already, we should just go right over to Reza.
Okay.
If people need breaks, they can take brief breaks of their own. But let's go ahead and start. Reza has worked on, is at the University of Bochum and has worked on Rawls and Kant on rights, as well as political philosophy in general, and is speaking today on the topic Kant, intersectionality, and the worst of all. So, Reza.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew, Helga, Jordan, and Macarena for being here. I try my PowerPoint, hope that it works, and I hope that you could hear me. Is it working?
Yes, everything's good.
Perfect. Okay.
Maybe,
So
maybe you can, yeah, there you go. Yeah.
yeah, right. Okay. So as you have said, I'm going in another direction as Helga did. So I still stick with this systematicity and very analytic methodology. And I want to connect these two topics, intersectionality on the one hand and worst of topos in the theories of justice on the other hand with each other, and take a look at Kant and see whether I could be kind of inspired by Kant, because at the end of the day, I don't have no hope to find some answers for some classic objections in the literature on intersectionality in Kantian works. But I will return to this. I'm pretty sure that most of you are very good familiar with the topic of intersectionality. In case this is not, if it is not the case, I just give you a very, very short introduction. Intersectionality refers to different things. I'm going to focus on intersectionality as a method of theorizing. But all these reference points, they hang together, kind of identities, its experiences, forms of oppression, and so on. So out of this perspective of a theoretical framework, I took a look at this mutual constitutive forces or axis of race, class, sex, gender, and so on. Unfortunately, we don't have an index for this axis. And this is a huge problem in the literature, as you know, but I will return to this. So you know that intersectionality or intersectional discrimination is understood as, you know, co-constitutive axis or converging axis or interwoven axis of certain social and natural categories, which result in forms of oppression, discrimination, and so on. What is important to me is that intersectionality could refer to both the privileged and the privileged against. They are correlative. So I'm going to refer to the latter today. And an example for that is a poor transgendered Muslim migrant. And you see that in discrimination axes are social class, sex and or gender, religion, and nation. So there are two major points about intersectionality. I think one is that the basic idea is that these crossroads create new form of discrimination. So and these new forms are causally, modally, and relationally different from their isolated constituent forms of discrimination merely added together. So I will call this the normative distinctiveness of intersectionality. Abbreviation is ND. I think, this quote in Crenshaw's first seminal paper on intersectionality, where she coined the term, is helpful, where she stresses that intersectional experiences are more than the sum of the elements, constituent elements. So it's a kind of relationship between the whole and parts. But this is another topic. I can't go into this today. I think there is a negative argument in favor of ND, normative distinctiveness of intersectionality, which goes like this, that if intersectionality wouldn't be a distinctive normative category, it would be reducible to the elements of which it is supposed to be composed, and then the whole discourse collapses. So you don't need it. You just break it down to those elements, and you at the end of the day, you make your add up, and you get what you actually you are hoping for from the whole theories about the intersectionality. And I think there's a positive argument for normative distinctiveness of intersectionality, which runs like this, that in reality, identities, experiences, and forms of discrimination are always an intersection of natural or social categories. E.g., whether tacit or explicitly, race is always gendered and gender is always racialized. So, and I think there are, of course, other arguments in favor of ND, but I can't go into them. Another basic idea in this whole theories of intersectionality is that they normatively include their constituents and non-vice versa. So if one regards the injustices from the intersectional point of view, one cannot ignore their discriminatory constituents. But if one is only focused on one or some of their constituents, they run the risk of ignoring other constituents, and more importantly, they most probably disregard their interaction. And I'm going to call this the normative inclusiveness. Two quotes, they come afterwards, but before that, maybe just a clarification of this normative inclusiveness. If the injustices regarding those intersectionally discriminated against are addressed, then they are, a fortiori, addressed regarding those who are discriminated against by one or some of the constituents of the intersection in question. And I think this is which makes intersectionality as a highly important tool, as Jordan mentioned that. But again, I will return to this. Here two short quotes, one by Deborah King, sociologist, where she emphasizes or highlights the necessity of addressing all oppressions, of course, as far as it's possible. And then this very famous last quote in first paper of Kimberly Crenshaw on intersectionality, when she writes, or she quotes actually, that when they enter, which means those who are intersectionally discriminated against, we all enter. There are, of course, other analytic benefits of intersectionality. I just skipped that. Karastathis did a great job on that, the whole book. So besides the inclusivity, there are points of simultaneity, complexity, and irreducibility, to deal with oppressions or forms of oppressions, and intersectionality gives us that tool. So I go to the, this is a quote in another paper by Karastathis. I give you just 2 or 3 seconds to read it to yourself. All right. So I go to the second part of my talk, where I put it as an assumption. I know that I need a lot of reasons and arguments to make this possible, what I'm assuming here, and this is one of the major pillars of my whole account. But again, today I don't have time for this, and I put it forward as an assumption, and it goes like this: that in matters of justice, there must be a position which specifies the points of view from which certain social norms, structures, and etc. about inequality must be normatively judged and decided for. And I then take this to be the perspective of the Vorstaff. I'm saying that upfront. I do not think that we can, I call it priority thesis. I do not think that we can find this in Kant. I do believe there is priority thesis in Marx, in a version in Thomas Hobbes, but I do not think that we can find this in Kant, but we could discuss this. So this is the priority thesis. I just presuppose this. I know there is need for reasons for that, but this is today at least just one assumption. I then connect the thick concept of Vorstaff as opposed to a thin concept, so like economically Vorstaff, with intersectionality, and put forward this claim that from a social justice point of view, those who are most disadvantaged or worst off are intersectionally discriminated against. So henceforth, worst off hyphenated. Or put it another way, the least advantage should be conceived in terms of intersectionality. This is one of the most important claims that I have in this account, actually. A qualification, E does not obtain reversely. So those who are in certain respects intersectionally discriminated against are not necessarily the worst off. So being intersectionally discriminated against is a matter of degree. And if you put D and E together, namely priority thesis and what I've just said, the result is the worst off as intersectionally discriminated against should provide the standard normative point of view for judging, gauging, policymaking, and so on of or for injustices. So now we are in NAKS series. I have at some point get back to Kant. So I raise again my guiding question. Could there be a Kantian point of view explaining why the worst off hyphenated normally matter? So this is the question that when I try to connect intersectionality. with Kant, but I have to specify this question. It's not precise enough. Before doing that, let me give you 3 remarks. First, I think that priority thesis is completely in line with Crenshaw's famous basement analogy, or in that final quote I have read out. So for those who are not familiar with basement analogy, here is the passage. Again, I leave you 2 or 5 seconds, read it to yourself. This is a very, very influential analogy in the first paper by Crenshaw on intersectionality in 1989. All right. My second remark, of course, refers to Rawls, because when we hear that word worse up, we think about the difference principle, we connect that with Rawls. So I'm going totally another way. So as you know that, Rawls' concept of worse of course, is based on priority thesis. This is a quote here when he says, a particular position from which the social and economic inequalities of the basic structure are to be judged is necessary for his conception of justice. But his basic idea is that the worst of give the standard normative vantage point when it comes to justify economic inequalities. In his last book, Justice as Fairness, he even reduced that to just income, not even wealth. And of course, provided that all citizens equal basic rights and liberties and fair opportunities are secure, mainly the first principle of justice and the first part of the second principle of justice. And then here you have this quote that he clearly says that the least advantage in his account are not identifiable as men or women, or as whites or blacks. And there were discussion between Rawls and Derek Parfin on this topic, but I'm not going into that. And let me do nevertheless justice to Rawls, because he is actually concerned with ideal theory, so the account of a well-ordered society. But he was at the same time, I don't think that he was reluctant to single out positions that suffer inequalities, which are founded on fixed nature characteristics, like sex or race, if race were a natural property. Sometimes he talks about race as if he were a naturalist, but this is another topic. So he doesn't consider the social constructionist metaphysics of race in his account. And the third remark pertains to the prioritarianism, because worst off, the topic of worst off in theories of justice, this reminds us of prioritarianism. This is actually the core part of their theory. As you know, prioritarians and egalitarians both agree, I quote Parfit here, that it is morally more important to benefit the people who are worst off. But prioritarians give priority to the worst off, not because this will reduce inequality, but only because these people are at a lower absolute level. With other words, egalitarians see, the badness or wrongness of worst off relationally, but prioritarians, they are not doing that. So I try to develop my account in a way where my reasons are really neutral about these 2 main positions of the wrongness or badness of worst off in the context of injustices. So these were 3 remarks. I go to the third part, a step closer to Kant himself. And there you have the classic question. First of all, for the first question, why look at Kant with an intersectional lens? Does it make sense or not? So we Kantian intersectionalists, I think we hear that in every conference, at least in my classes, people just ask me, why are you doing that? Does it make sense or not? And there's another question which is a bit more charitable. So could there be a Kantian account that contributes to intersectionality positively? So there are, of course, like in every possible topic in philosophy, cons and pros. Again, typical cons are, the objection of anachronism, or that there are no or just few textual supports. The best you could do, you have to put, some passages about unnatural sex, gender, and race together, and then you get to the point of intersectionality. But this wasn't Kant's concern. And besides, I think this objection, for that I chose this quotation in Tina Fernando's Boats for You is important. We have touched on that. So this is this topic of universality, systematicity on the one hand, and on the other hand, this really particularity of intersectional experiences, and how could we make them compatible. Just read it to yourself what Butts write here. And I think there are a lot of intersectionalists who are thinking like that. So maybe Kantian intersectionalists are the minority. All right, so the point is, if you sympathize with this kind of objection, then it seems that for some intersectionalists, or for the whole discourse of intersectionality, it would be a categorical mistake to refer to Kant, because he is exactly the opposite, methodologically and semantically. But I think this is, again, another topic. It is highly questionable whether intersectionality could be of any normative use if we didn't have a principled way of organizing at least some aspects or some ideas of intersectionality in certain respects. And I try to do something, in this direction, actually. Pros, that we could find resources in Kant philosophy, of course, in need of reconstruction, rewriting, adjustment, improvement, and so on. And they might organize some aspects of intersectionality, with regards to the literature and the discussion which is going on. So I for one, I am really skeptical that Kant's practical philosophy could offer anything that would satisfy the priority thesis. So I think the standard normative point of view in Kant's moral philosophy is rather the general point of view of homo noumenon, which all human beings are supposed to share equally. But it seems that there is an insensitivity here in Kant's philosophy. So along the line that we are all homo noumena, but, so example, if one were racialized or gendered, there are for Kant nevertheless grave inequalities, despite the fact of reason that we all human beings are of the same kind and actually potentially have the same share of the nominal core, if I say so. So this is a problem I see there, and I do not think that is a problem we could underestimate. It's a huge one. The other one is that one major criticism of intersectionality, as you're familiar with it, is that it adds arbitrarily to the discriminatory categories. And I think this is one of the main methodological problems with this approach of bottom-up. And again, I do not think that Kant could help us here. Although after listening to Helga, maybe referring to some parts of his anthropology, maybe we have some hopes. But I think these axes of discriminatory axis in the discourse of intersectionality, they are mostly a posteriori. Depending on the metaphysics of race or gender we are defending, of course, but most of them we discovered them by looking at the past injustices, or in a Rawlsian language, non-ideal situations or circumstances. And I do not see a way, I personally, that Kant could offer us a principled way to put forward an index of this axis. So fourth part, last section of my talk, I think that political legal thought of Kant could still provide us with a powerful way to capture the distinctive badness of being forced off in terms of intersectionality. A way which is, I think, more informative than capturing this badness with terms like, simultaneous oppression or multidimensional discrimination. But as I think there is no systematic place for forced off in Kant's theory, of course, we have to rewrite him and reread him from an intersectional perspective. So against this background, this is my suggestion as a way to capture, the badness, distinctive badness of forced off hyphenated. And I suggest to do that in terms of a cross-constitutive relation of the triad of freedom, equality, and independence, and not least the rightful honor. This is Kant's translation for Honestas Juridica in the Doctrine of Right. So as you know, Kant draws on the coherent triad of these conditions as inseparable attributes of citizens of the state, and later with some changes of diction of the Republic in the essay on peace. So I go very, very quickly through these three elements, and the way I am reading them in Kant's works. The first one, I read this as a pluralistic legal freedom, meaning that the legal political self-determination, meaning this political legal self-determination. In his on the common saying from 1793, Kant gives us a lot of information about this sort of this form of freedom, and he says that it consists in the determination of one's own happiness. In a Rawlsian language, you could say it's a self-determination regarding one's own conception of the good, and it is actually a form of freedom which is omnilaterally limited by the universal principle of law. The interesting thing is that both Kant and Humboldt thought that violation of this form of freedom is the harshest form of despotism. Kant goes even farther, saying that a system, an order which violates this form of freedom abolishes all freedom of the subject, who then have no right at all. So he's pretty much radical here. The second element, you know it again, this is a civil equality, universal legal equality before judicial obligation under public law. Famously, Kant, sees this equality only between the members within the state. He excludes the head of the state from these systematic juridical relations. And nonetheless, he says, or he seems to say, that this form of juridical equality is pretty much compatible with a strong or massive wealth gap. This is at least one passage in the common saying. But as I am taking liberties with Kant, I do not include these limitations in my account. I try to develop a Kantian account. I do not exegesis here. Third, you have these natural and socioeconomic independence, which is a condition that determines who can be a co-legislator in the political community. And again, you know all these notorious passages where Kant once, on the basis of natural qualities, he talks about sex, but also gender. Frauenzimmer in German is a gendered word. He limits this active right, and a second time on the basis of acquisitive quality of certain economic conditions, so that people who lack these two forms of independency, they are not their own master, and their existence is, as it were, only inherent. And again, this is important, the way how he to see how one could find passages in Kant where you grasp an idea of intersectional injustices. But again, I'm developing a Kantian account. I think Jordan, like 3-4 weeks ago in her talk, touched on these topics, and in her excellent book too. So let me go farther. This is the final question, final condition, the fourth one, having rightful honor, or as I read this, being a rights asserter. So in the Doctrine of Right, you know that Kant follows Ulpian trio in letter, but redefines the precept honeste viva as rightful honor, which, I quote, consists in asserting one's worth as a human being in relation to others, unquote, and could be expressed as the following self-regarding duty or a reformulation of the humanity formula from the perspective of the first person singular. I quote, do not make yourself a mere means for others, but be at the same time an end for them. More interestingly, Kant's understanding of both self-respect and avoidance of servility in the doctrine of virtue is intimately connected with the rightful honor. So the avoidance of servility implies that one should not disavow the moral self-esteem. He goes on and says it can be recognized with reference to the dignity within us, and it shows itself, manifests itself in the following: do not let others tread with impunity on your rights. So here's my proposal as one possible way to grasp the badness, distinctive badness of being worse off hyphenated, as opposed to only economically worse, being economically worse off, or those who are, if it were the case, one-sidedly or monocategorically discriminated against. I suggest to do that in terms of lacking pluralistic legal freedom, civil equality, independence based both on natural and socioeconomic status, and not least the lack of rightful honor in ways, this is very important, that they co-constitute. Let me elucidate. So divorce of lack this form of freedom to the effect that they miss a whole spectrum from certain abilities to opportunities to determining their own permissible conceptions of good. Divorce of lack civil equality in the sense that they lie invisibly or ignored in legal blind spots, and or they struggle with harsh, multiply discriminatory laws and rules. And this is actually the point of all of writings by Kimberly Crenshaw. They lack these forms of independence to the effect that they are not political and legal co-deciders, and which means in legal political respect, they are not their own masters. And finally, they lack rightful honor in the sense that they cannot or are only hardly able to assert their own legitimate claims and state or restore their related self-respect. There are still two remarks here. I think it is possible to be worse off, not worst off, worse off in terms of one or some of these aspects without being discriminated against by others. What characterizes, however, the badness of the worst off is that the lacking aspects constitute each other. That is, they all work at the same time and reinforce each other mutually. And the second remark is that I defend the proposal reversely, namely, if we have a co-constitutive relationship of these lacking aspects, this will mark the worst off in terms of intersectionality. That is, according to the priority thesis, the standard normative point of view from which we should judge the inequalities in the society. I think there are some benefits to this proposal. I make it very, very short. I don't know how many minutes I have, Andrew.
Yeah, we could, 5 minutes max.
Okay, I'm gonna manage that. So I think one benefit is that it frames intersectionality from the outset in political respect. The other one is that by addressing the freedom in terms of building one's own conception of good, it bonds with the multiplicity or pluralistic feature of intersectional identities, experiences, both on the side of the possessors and those or the institutions which interact with them. And you see this is connected with the aspect I, or freedom. The other benefit, I think, is that it focuses on legal transparency and equality and inclusiveness as main incentives and inducements of intersectionality discourse. Another one is that it foregrounds the political autonomy by addressing discrimination based on natural and social properties connected with aspects of civil equality and independence. And finally, I think it calls attention to the significance and empowering aspect of being an active rights asserter and the related self-respect. So I come to close my talk with some final comparisons with Crenshaw's more detailed characterization of intersectionality in her second important paper on this topic, Mapping the Margins, as it's from 1991. There, Crenshaw talks about three forms of intersectionality. The first one, structural intersectionality, refers to the location of intersectionality discriminated against. She's dealing with women of color at the intersection of race and gender without excluding other cases. This is very important in her writings. And she talks here, about the result of structural intersectionality as something which is qualitatively different or creates qualitatively different experiences and remains in blind spots. So people who are intersectionally discriminated against, they occupy positions that are both physically and culturally marginalized within dominant society. The second form is political intersectionality, very interesting, and this refers to being situated in between conflicting political agendas and so subjected to mutual allegiance. Example, again, women of color's position, which resides between men of color's agenda and the white feminist agenda. And so they fall into the void between concerns about women's issues and concerns about racism. The third form is the representational intersectionality, referring to the culture's construction of images of intersectionality discriminated against, where one critical discourse fails to acknowledge the significance of the others. So here I have two quotes, I guess, one by Crenshaw, one by Karastatis. The stories our culture tells about the experience of women of color is an example of that. It includes both the way in which these images are produced through a confluence of prevalent narratives of race and gender, unquote, i.e. drawing on sexist and racist narrative tropes, as well as a recognition of how contemporary critiques of racist and sexist representation marginalize, unquote, or reproduce the objectification of women of color. So final word, I think I keep it very, very short. I think that the proposed Kantian account could, contravene all these forms of intersectionality. First, by connecting the two discourses of the worst of and intersectionality, it regards the very normative blind spots as the standard view of judging the inequalities. For example, regarding different priorities and different allocation needed for the worst of in particular societies. Second, it challenges being torn between conflicting political agendas, since the position of the worst of determines the primary political agenda. It's the standard view according to this account. And not least, one aspect of the worst of to have rightful honor or being active rights asserters is to provide them with opportunity of being their own storyteller, thus contributing themselves against the dominant cultural images and narratives that sorry, I just forgot this, that narratives that marginalize them. So I'm finished with the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Reza. With comments, we will hear from Macarena Marey from the University of Buenos Aires.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you, Reza, for your talk. Well, I'm not going to give any Kantian account of things. I will focus only on intersectionality. My first concern is, what is the point of intersectionality? And to see that we have to trace the genealogy of intersectionality, and I think that Helga did that wonderfully at the beginning of her talk. The origin of intersectionality is social struggles, not just someone sitting on a philosophy department. Very, very unprivileged people fighting against an imbrication of systems of domination. Another word for intersectionality is hierarchy, as you will as I am sure you know, no, which is a word that comes from a queer and feminist theology, theologer, Elizabeth Schlusser-Fiorenza. She coined the term in 1992. So, as you well know, intersectionality as a category has received many critiques from people of color, from feminists, from the third world, mainly because it's been basically whitewashed. And the problem is when people from the better off position or the best off position take this concept to use it to their own advantage. So we have to avoid that and reclaim the concept of intersectionality. This is what I always talk about, and with this comes the idea of displacing concepts. So I applaud your idea of reading Kant from the point of view of intersectionality, because it is a way of occupying Kant, of reclaiming Kant for another narrative of power and a history of philosophy. My problem with your presentation, or with your paper today, is that I believe that your explanation of the worst of is not intersectional, but just a description of what being worst of is, that no one in the liberal tradition could reject, but I think almost everyone from other perspectives, critical theories, intersectionalist theories would reject. So the first point of intersectionality is its focus on social struggles rather than people designing public policies in institutions, in state institutions. So our focus is social inequality, social injustices, social unfairness, and of course, institution and the state, but when we think of them as highly influenced by those inequalities. So the state is not the place of perfect neutral search for justice, but itself a place where injustice is being reinforced and reinscribed. So that is one of the points of intersectionality. The other point is that, which is another way of seeing these things I've been saying, is that it is the implication of different systems of domination that produce a world that is deeply, deeply unjust. So our point of departure, our point zero, is a very unjust world where injustices are very complex. This means, for instance, that, for example, racism, it is not a deviation from a perfectly harmonic and otherwise very just normative order, but it is an essential component of the normative order itself. So racist people are not just doing individual, or they are not individually breaking the normative order, but acting out what the normative order actually is. That is to say, racist. So we have a very, very big problem, because we are dealing with a whole system of domination, which includes epistemology, an episteme of domination. Against that epistemic of domination, we should develop epistemologies of resistance. And the problem is that we have a problem even at the time of perceiving the specificity of the injustice we are dealing with. And this is where intersectionality comes in hand. It explains a lot. It helps us see what we are not yet seeing. It helps us see, for instance, the way a trans woman from the global south, from the third world, is being, it suffers from injustices that cannot be explained if we look at her just because she's trans, or just because she lives in the global south. So I believe this talks about a whole, I don't want to say ontology, but I will because I lack of the word, a whole ontology of injustice and justice, which is very different to the liberal tradition, which is very different to the way the liberal thinkers and philosophers see the world. So there we have a point of departure from the Rawlsian tradition, if you will, and the idea of the worst of. Then another point of intersectionality is, and I believe that Kimberly Crenshaw highlights this, and it is due to its origin in social struggles. It is that we have to look at every specific context. That is to say, racialization does not work in the same way in Argentina, where I live, where I'm speaking from, as in the States, as in Europe. So every practical context has its different relation to these processes of inferiorization. Charles Mills was one of the philosophers who always insisted on this. You have to look at the materiality of racialization that works differently in every different practical context and in every different periods of times in the same place. So attention to actual practical realities is key when we do intersectional approaches to the problems of injustice. So we need a non-ideal approach. Whether this is possible or not, it's a very controversial question, but I believe we should at least try to make a non-ideal approach. That is to say, to pay attention to the problems of a specific contexts and give them priority and those problems in universal terms, because they can qualify the way the concept works. Instead of applying an abstract concept to a context, we should do the other way around. Elizabeth Anderson is the one who most clearly, for me, from my point of view, exemplifies this sort of analysis. And in this sense, if you buy all this stuff I've been trying to sell you, intersectionality is about also political agents. So it's not thinking how you could help the worst off, but give an account, a political account that could give the worst off the political agency, the political leading role in social life, so they can transform this deeply unjust reality. Because the point of intersectionality is radical transformation of social relations. Of course, this is also very, very hard to do because of another feature of intersectionality, which has to do with the way it perceives justice in history. And I believe if you are an intersectionalist, you perceive justice and injustices as an open condition. This means you can make the world tomorrow a better place, but maybe new subjectivities, new corporalities, new agents will emerge that will suffer from different injustices. So this transformation is always ongoing, and it doesn't mean you will arrive at a perfect, fair, and perfect just place. So you have to pay attention to your own attachments to innocence. And by this I am referring to a paper recently published in a Spanish magazine, which is called Las Torres de Luca, a paper I edited for a dossier, sorry for the self-promotion, by philosophers Paulo Rabeca and Elizabeth Dauphiné, which is called What is Left of Critique. And there they critique this phenomenon they call the attachments to innocence, that we in academia are very prone to fall into this problem. When we say, well, I want to do an intersectional analysis, I am just assuming maybe that I will be able to perceive the way racism, sexism, imperialism, ableism, ageism, and so forth work within a context. But maybe I am not perceiving my own implication and imbrication in that system of in those systems of domination, and the way I myself I am being sexist, racist, imperialist, and so ableist, and so on and so forth. So we have to have our perception highly alert in order not to fall prey of this theoretical attitude, which is a moral attitude. And then we gain a lot in academia by performative saying we are not racist, we are anti-racist, we are anti-sexist, but then you have to do the work of being to show how you are actually changing that situation. And if you have privileges, practicing those engagements maybe will imply that you will lose some of your privileges. So that is why it is so hard to do the actual work. So I would like to say that anachronism and disloyal readings are not a bad thing at all. You can do them. You have to be creative philosophically. And again, as on Monday, I'm thinking about Inés Valdés, how she defends, well, let's do anachronistic and disloyal readings of Kant. And then I have many notes on the paper you sent me, which have to do with these things I'm saying, and particularly to the Kantian part. Let me get it because I have the comments written on and I can see them. I have to click on them. Just a minute. So some things out of the top of my head, I haven't been thinking about this, or I mean, criticizing your interpretation of the Kantian principles. To start with, we have to pay attention to this. Isn't this reading of the Kantian political principles just a certain vision of what a good liberal society would look like? So many critical theories will reject even your definition of freedom. And they have reasons, very important reasons to do that, not just because they don't like liberals. As to civil equality, again, we have to pay attention to difference. This is also what intersectionality is about. And here the work of Audre Lorde and Angela Davis is very important to realize how the unity of the struggles is a product of the recognition of diversity, and how diversity is very creative. And what we have to avoid is of homogeneity. I don't know how do you say that in English. This is as to equality. And then independence, I don't know if independence is a cool idea to have, because there is no such a thing as independence. We are interdependent beings, and I think Kant would agree on that. So that ideal is, I believe, it is not very intersectional also, because it has been criticized from these sides, the feminist theory, critical theory, a critical race theory from where I am, from third world and so forth. So maybe we can get a revision of those ideals when we pay attention to actual intersectional theories instead of the theory of intersectionality. So maybe instead of reading papers on the concept, very abstract and difficult concept of intersectionality, it is more useful to read actual works that are very, very highly intersectional. For me, the most intersectional piece of work is Angela Davis' Women, Race, and Class, but we also have other sources to feed our political imagination, which are Gloria Alzaldúa, Borderlands, La Frontera, because the very concept of mestiza is essential to develop a theory of intersectionality. So there you have border thinking, also border epistemologies, which opens up the way we perceive these political principles of freedom, equality, independence, and the very idea of freedom itself. I also the work of María Lugones, who brings coloniality into the picture. In general, I am not 100% sure of what I'm about to say, but I feel like works on intersectionality tend to lose sight of coloniality and privilege, racialization, generification, which is what you have to do, but also bring coloniality into the picture. And this is, just to wrap up my comment, intersectionality is also about, this is at least my interpretation of it, the idea, to use Audre Lorde's words, that there is no hierarchy of oppressions. So it is not like a competition, who is worse, who has less rights. In grasping that concept, there is a lot of work done. I mean, when you think about this phrase of Audre, there is no hierarchy of oppressions, you start to see how intersectionality actually plays a role in injustice. Well, I have many other comments, as I told you on the document, but I want to finish this, but stressing the point that intersectionality is about transforming the world, about making it a less unjust place. And I don't know if we are doing something very big today, but the fact that I was invited to take part in this, it tells us a very cute story about how we are growing up in this sense. I believe Helga does a really cool job, not only by being a really good philosopher. By the way, Helga, you treat everyone as your equal. I believe this can be a very stupid thing to say, but I am not always treated as an equal when I do philosophy. I generally am treated as case study because of my identity, and being treated as a philosopher, as having a universal voice, it's a piece of success, right? It's a story of success, of how you can have a real actual transformation in reality. Well, that is all.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Andrew. Am I supposed to reply now? Yeah.
Yeah, but if people have questions for you, could they put their hands up? Just, we don't have much time, so I want to see.
Okay, I can keep it short. I mean,
Yeah.
We'll see. It's fine. So. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, Macarena, thank you very much. I mean, this is a bunch of important points. Some of them I do buy, some of them I do not because I do not recognize them, but because I do think that I have them already. So, I mean, you know, every form of social wrongness, of course, had with social struggling, something to do with social struggling. I mean, I'm not sure whether this is informative, you know, to emphasize this. So, and I do not know, I wouldn't know why an institutional account on the one hand, and an account which is sociologically is rather focused on social struggles, why should they be mutually exclusive? I know, yeah, okay, then we are fine both, actually. I do not know why, I wouldn't know why the idea of worse off is necessarily or inherently a liberal idea. It is not. So take, there are so many examples in the history in Christianity. I mean, and I do not think that Rawls has this idea from Kant, but I do think he has it from Marx. So the very idea of the worst off is coming, if you like, so is coming from the environment outside of the liberal tradition. What seems to be, you know, genuinely a liberal approach is maybe the emphasizing the rights. But again, I do not know so many critical theories which, you know, again, inherently were against the language of rights. So, and if so, I think that they have the burden to explain why and which conception of right actually. So this is the case. I wouldn't know any critical philosopher who seriously would say, no, we don't need something like a pluralistic freedom. So, I mean, that would be very, very puzzling, actually. And I try to keep my language pretty much neutral against these traditions. Another thing is, well, you're speaking of racism, I wasn't sure, are you talking about structural racism or systemic racism? Because these different forms, you know, that change the discussions. I cannot go into this, but you and we could discuss that afterwards. I would be very much looking forward to your notes. Another point was this differentiation between ideal theory and non-ideal theory. I personally do not like this you know, dichotomical framework of analysis. and really avoid to use that. But if you are saying so, that I am doing ideal theory, but I have to rather focus on non-ideal theory, I would say they both need each other. I mean, if you are going out in the reality and try to diminish or eliminate non-ideal injustices, you have to have some ideas and ideal and principles according to which you are trying to fight those injustices. Otherwise, it's not possible. And I think this is one of the main points of Thomas Shelby against Charles Mills. So again, I do not like this dichotomy, but if you are going to operate with that, that would be my answer. The word independence, I wouldn't take that so by word. You know, Kant changes this term in the essay of peace. And instead of independence, he's talking about equal. The semantic is important, and which means you are, you know, you are kind of, yeah, I mean, dependent on the other people. And again, it's so open and formal that I think that a lot of feminist theories and queer theories could find themselves in there. I mean, I know they are not Kantians, but at some point I told that I'm not doing exegesis of Kant's psyche, or what was his attitude, motives, and stuff like that. This is really not my concern, and we don't have any epistemic access to his psyche. How should I know that? You know, the most we know that he had some sexist or racist beliefs, a set of beliefs. More, I wouldn't know that we could discover more than that. Last point, and I leave it there, then we could communicate afterwards. The idea of that there is no hierarchy in oppression. I know the theory, and it's really, you know, I do not like it, because oppression is a matter of degree. And if you take that element of graduality out of oppression, then any single tiny oppression is as bad as the other forms. And I really don't know how informative and useful that in the real life and in different particular societies with different histories. I mean, you know, you are from Argentina. I am originally from Iran, and you could imagine how many complicated layers of injustices my mother, my sister, my whole family experience. So I'm pretty much familiar with these particular and genuinity of intersectional experiences. And I think the graduality of oppression is highly important. The big question is where to draw the line. I mean, which forms of oppressions are important, I mean, for the whole society, for the others, and intersectionality is something which gives us an answer, says, look, I am an inclusive theory, an inclusive tool, and if you take it from there, you have chances to you know, benefit the other people, but not the other way around. So this is one of the, I think, strongest points of intersectionality. But I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I just answer some of this? First of all,
yeah.
what Audre means is not what you are interpreting. So maybe just first read Audre before passing judgment or on her ideas. Then what you said about ideal theory and non-ideal theory, it is precisely what Elizabeth Anderson says. We don't just throw ideals out of the window. We use them in a different way. We test ideals with reality and not apply ideals to just any context. And the rest of I think you misunderstood what I said. I mean, I was not claiming that you didn't get the point. I just was trying to organize what intersectionality is about, and the importance of social struggles comes to highlight that it is about political agency, not just abstractly thinking about what is to be the worst of. And I still think that maybe while you do have good points, your description of the worst off has nothing to do with intersectionality. You're just saying some people are worst off, which no one could deny, and then say, well, they are worst off because they do not have complete access to these Kantian rights. And a lot of people deny that that description is a good description of what we should aim to, because it is highly ideological liberal, and not all theories hierarchize or whatever the principles in the same manner, and not all political contexts will agree with that idea of the world. I think that there is a geographical difference between where I am from and where you are from, is that liberalism has caused a lot of bad things in Latin America. Coup d'etat, violence, murders, a lot of very, very, very bad things. And we don't like liberalism here. And I believe that maybe in other parts of the world where your problems are different, you think liberalism is a good way to go, but it is not. And there are other visions of the world. We have Pinochet in Chile, that is liberalism for us. The military junta is liberalism for me.
Talk about this.
So thank you, Reza.
Okay.
Okay. I think we should head it off here. That's great. Really interesting debate and two important perspectives. Thanks to all the speakers for a wonderful panel. We did record it, and we will. Yeah, exactly. Helga says to be continued. We did record it, and the talks portion of the session will be available at some point on our website. But let's thank the speakers again, and we'll look forward to seeing some of you in a couple of weeks for a session on Kant on the South. Thanks, everybody.